Welcome to our MOOCs on Introduction to Sociology 2, and today we shall be doing the topic Disciplinary Trajectory and Pluralism. Now, this had been quite a journey for you, and we have been exploring the different nooks and crannies of sociology as a discipline and trying to negotiate across the different corners of its trajectory. Now, before we do it, we shall be learning to know how exactly is the trajectory of the sociology as a discipline and how much pluralistic is it as we had been claiming. Come, let's explore. Now, what is pluralism? One of the ways in which political sociologists seek to understand how representatives attempt to balance the competing demands is through a theoretical perspective called pluralism. Pluralism sees the political system as a struggle between competing interests, groups for power and control of the decision-making process, where no single group is in control all the time. Arthur F. Bentley, one of the original exponents of the pluralist perspective, claimed that examining the activities of interest groups was the only valid way to study the political process. So, pluralistic perspective, or pluralism as we say, is a kind of an ideology or a kind of a structure where we are trying to look for the tussle, the tug of war, the conflict that is happening between the different groups as they are trying to hover around the concept of power, as they are trying to take away the crux of power from the dominant ones. So it's a process of bargaining. It's a kind of a conflict where people vie for power amongst each other and trying to compete for similar positions. So it is not a constant position, but rather one in equilibrium, where there is always a kind of a circulation, and power doesn't happen to be in the hands of a single person for a very long time. Power is circulative in nature, and it goes circulating from one hand to the other. Neutral forum. In the pluralistic perspective, the government itself, also known as the state, has no preference or any particular issue or policy, but instead exists as a kind of a neutral forum where the preferences of different interest groups and individual citizens can be gathered and evaluated in an effort to provide the public with the sorts of policies and services that are mostly desired. Individual representatives, on the other hand, may have their own personal policy, preferences on any number of issues or policies before them, and may have their own ideas about what is best for the public. Nonetheless, the numerous structural constraints on their ability to advance the preferences, ranging from the need to stand for re-election, to the threat of being removed from the office, to being subjected to withering criticism in the press, effectively reduce them to just one or more voice in the chorus, expressing a preference on any particular issue. So we are talking about a kind of a neutral forum, where the state, the government, or the sovereignty will not be vouching for a particular program or a policy. Rather, it is the multiple demands of the people which has to be catered. Often this happens that some of the interest groups who have been hankering for power or attention have been left out. And because of the structural constraints, there is a very little way that they can go out to express their thoughts and their propositions. And sometimes their voices get drowned in the melee of the multitude. Sometimes this happens, but nevertheless, when we are talking about a plural perspective, we are talking about a neutral forum, where neither the state nor the sovereignty will be vouching for any particular interest group or any particular preferences, but will have to take into account the needs, the preferences, the demands, and the wants of the multiple. Diffusion of power. They argue that by preventing any one group or branch of government from consolidating too much power over too long a period of time, a democratic state becomes in fact more stable because it is less likely to descend into tyranny. Robert A. Dahl, one of the foremost pluralist theorists, explained this idea with a simple syllogism. Tyranny means the accumulation of all powers, etc. Tyranny is undesirable. Therefore, the accumulation of all powers, etc. is undesirable. As we are repeatedly saying that sociological trajectory is pluralistic in nature, and whenever we use the term pluralism, it means that power has to be distributed across the trajectory. There should not be one particular conglomeration or a consignment which actually holds power for itself. Power must be diffused across the stratum. And why this happens? Because across the continuum, if power floats and power is made to, be mobilized across the sections, that everybody will have a chunk of power and pleasure for themselves, a kind of a privilege for themselves. If you ought to make somebody powerful, and if power remains in the hands of a few for a very long time, that particular section, party, individual, unit or group, whichever we are talking about, especially group, that becomes extremely tyrannical or despotic and monopolistic. In order to stop doing that, we will be talking about pluralistic idea of the distribution of power, where power is coercive in nature, but it's circulative and is made to be transferred from one individual to another. Before we look for such a pluralism in sociology, we need to know what does pluralism mean. In many ways, the pluralistic perspective stands in opposition to the elite theory perspective for understanding the political process. The elite theory perspective, as articulated by C. Wright Mills, postulates that power is not diffused throughout society, but rather consolidated in the hands of a very small group of people, referred to by Mills as a power elite, who can look down upon, so to speak, and by their decisions mightily affect the everyday worlds of men and women. Whereas the decisions made by most people, even personally important decisions, such as who to marry, what to study in school, or what career to pursue, do not have much impact beyond their own personal lives. The power elite are in positions to make decisions having major consequences. And in many cases, their failure to make decisions is itself an act that is often of greater consequence than the decisions they do make. So, in the elitistic theory, there is always a propensity that decisions will be taken by a very few people. And it is a minority who rolls over the majority. And the power remains conglomerated, confined in the hands of the few. But as we move into pluralism, it talks about a paradigm shift. It talks about a kind of a structure which is more percolative in nature, so that power can percolate from one area to another. C. Wright Mills always tried to make a distinction between the personal and the public. Certain things we think that these things are personal decisions. We are taking very personal decisions. But in the long run, they will have a much more impact upon us. So, there is always a necessity to distinguish between what is public and what is private, and to what extent I am able to take personal decisions. Very crucial things in life, such as selection of mates, etc., are actually very personal decisions. But how much personalized are they? And how much can we really submerge ourselves in the pluralistic genre to take a personal decision like this actually matters. Nelson Polsby identified 4 key features of the pluralistic perspective that distinguishes it from the elite theory perspective articulated by Mills and others. First and perhaps most fundamentally, pluralists directly reject the fundamental assumption held by elite theorists that one particular group dominates the decision-making process in all states and community. As a consequence, the first question is, a pluralist researcher will ask, such as, not that what is likely that who runs this community, will not ask a question like this, but rather the question that he will be more propounded to ask is, does anyone at all run this community? Since pluralists believe that power cannot be taken for granted, they must instead empirically study specific outcomes in order to determine who actually prevails in community decision making. Most often this entails simply observing who took each side on a series of issues and taking note of the ultimate winners and losers. When you're talking about the traits of plurality, it is important to know that what is again the essential difference between the elite and the pluralistic theory. When you move into a pluralistic theory, it's very less likely that the researcher will ask you that who runs the community, who are the people who are more privileged. Rather, the question should be who actually participates in the decision making, and does actually is there anyone who runs the community, or everyone, in a collective manner actually runs the power nexus. So the questions like this are quite tempting because we are trying to bridge the gap between the minority and the majority and trying to give more and more onus and responsibility to those who are left out. And probably when we study the outcomes of who have become the winners, who have become the losers, and when we take note of how the society was actually run, we will be able to understand that those people who have been left in the lurch. Transitory power structures. The second feature of pluralism that distinguishes it from the elite theory perspective is that when a particular individual or a group demonstrates the ability to exercise power, that power is neither permanent nor all-encompassing. In contrast to a more or less permanent dominant class composed of the possessors of power and wealth and celebrity, people of superior character and energy, the pluralist conception of power according to Paulsby is tied to issues. And issues can be fleeting or persistent, provoking coalition among interested groups ranging in their duration from momentary to semi-permanent. This group that holds power over a particular issue at any particular point of time is the group that is best able to build and mobilize an effective coalition to achieve a policy victory over the other side. Whenever we are talking about the transitory areas of power structure, according to pluralistic perspective, powerful is somebody who doesn't only have power, fame, authority, privilege, beauty for themselves, but is one who's able to engage with others, who are able to move into coalition with others, with other interest groups. The more you're able to accommodate others within your own fold, and you're able to make a policy which is suitable and accommodative and inclusive for others, that matter. So at one point of time, those people may be in power who are actually looking into the multiple demands of the people, who are looking into those people who have been left out and making a policy for them. So that may be very momentary, that may be transitory, but that is very important from a pluralistic perspective. Now we shall see the plurality that we had been talking in terms of sociological trajectory, how it is actually applied across the entire discipline. We'll start with sociology of race. Numerous sociologists engaged in interdisciplinary critical studies on race have embraced the writings emerging from critical race theory. These race scholars reject the traditional emphasis on assimilation or separating communities as ethnic or racial, but rather recognize race as a mode of constructing political communities and challenge discourse on a post-racial era of colorblindness and meritocracy. Critical race scholars focus on power relations and dominations central in maintaining the boundaries of national belonging and critique scholarship on multiculturalism and diversity, which emphasizes integration and assimilation. So there are different kinds of genres which are created in the sociological discipline itself. One is a sociology of race, where we are cutting across the traditional definitions of race and moving towards a much more defined and a open definition of race, where we are talking about multiculturalism and other kind of ethnical support and openness that actually talks of integration and unity in diversity, despite its urge for classification and segregation and stratification. A race theory to bridge micro and macro, task of a plural sociology. In addition to challenging ethnicity, class and nationality-based perspectives that tended to dominate the race subfield of sociology at the time of their initial writings, plural sociology wanted to more effectively bridge micro and the macro theorizing about race. Because a notable and intriguing feature of race is its ubiquity, its presence in both the small and the large features of social relationships, institutions and identities. So now when we are talking about race, we are no longer, confined to the ideas of ethnicity, class or nation. We are talking about a kind of ethnic or a race relation that is far more diverse and far more multiple in its areas of address. And therefore, whenever sociologist tends to be plural, it says that since race itself is something which is very universal or ubiquitous, it is necessary that we talk about the different dimensions and not just the three dimensions, the ethnicity, the nation and the class, which had been predominant for a very long time. New ideas of class going plural. Marxism has gone through many variations and addresses a wide range of issues. Indeed, it might be more appropriate to refer to these vast traditions as Marxisms. A large part of its durability and adaptability has to do with its variations and constant evolution. If simply read as sacred scriptures, Marx's writings would have died an ignominious death a long, long ago. It is a continual renewal and rethinking of Marxism that has led to its enduring relevance as a social theory, a means of understanding class issues, and an inspiration for social change. So these are the areas where we can, apply the pluralistic perspectives, because Marxian class had always been taken as an economic category, which actually goes on to say how social change and revolutions were formed and how social change was propagated. But no, we are not trying to study Marxist class in a similar way. Now there are different dimensions, and which has to be read in a separate pattern. So Marxist texts, if had been read in a similar way and in a simple way like that, Marx's ideas and those readings would have died an untimely death. But that we haven't done that. We were trying to revigorate, we were trying to reinterpret, and we were trying to give a different meaning to Marxist concepts altogether, which is more why we talk about the plurality in sociological trajectory, and that is its significance. Feminist theories and looking for plurality. Feminist theories originated in the 1960s to explain gender oppression as a social phenomenon, and by the 1980s had expanded to examine its intersections with racial, sexual, class, and geographical oppressions. In contrast to theories that claim a political objectivity, feminist theories historically emerged from and remain connected to the global movements for social change and social justice. Despite a common concern with women's oppression and general agreement that gender is central to understanding the world, the multiplicity and fluidity of feminist theories defy attempts to set out a standard taxonomy of types. Indeed, a major characteristic of the feminist theory is that they have been brave enough to take own history and presumptions as critical objects of inquiry. Contestation over its foundational categories like woman, gender, sex, sexuality, experience, feminism, and theory has and will continue to energize feminist theoretical debates. In light of the diversity of women's experiences and the multiplicity of feminist theories, in this plural sociological perspective, we lay out certain key themes and the leading epistemologies to present an overview of the ever-changing field. And, feminism had been a genre where we were talking about this kind of plurality in sociological perspective, because feminism, unlike other theories, had never considered it to be apolitically objective. Rather, it had vehemently rejected the very idea of objectivity, because its concepts and the categories which it had been using over the time, like sex, sexuality, gender, all these things have been problematized over the days, and there was no one central concept which was enough to elaborate on feminism. The epistemology itself was challenged, because it was no longer thought that it was a white man's domain, and it was a white man who was constructing these categories for us, that we have taken away the monopoly of the white men. There were areas where feminism had been challenging the existing epistemes, and therefore all those categories that it was using to construct the theory were quite fluid and mobile. Intersectionality. In light of the criticisms of grand theory as exclusionary and ethnocentric, feminist intellectuals also sought new ways to construct a theory that were reflective of the many differences and complicated power relationships among women. In place of theories examining women in general, feminist scholarship began to privilege historical specificity, concrete analysis of women's experiences in particular time and place, and along with exploring how gender oppression intersected from other forms of oppression. In attending to differences, feminist theories began to analyze social identities such as gender, race, class, and sexuality, not in isolation from one another, but in how they intersect and overlap to shape the individual's experiences of oppression and of privilege. Theorizing on intersectionality grew out of the explosion of writings by women of the color and transnational feminist scholars in the 1980s, and it continues to reflect the perspective. And intersectionality always comes, why? Because feminism, as it told us, is not a very cogent, collaborative, rather it's a collaborative one, but it's not a consolidated whole. There are different dimensions of it, and they crisscross against one another, such as sex, race, religion, one's economic conditions, one's status. All those positions, caste, class, all those positions actually zigzag into one another. And even the relationships are more complex than we can think of. Even there are differences within women which must be recognized, and they must be taken as what do I say, agents in a particular historical continuum, and they must be located accordingly. I'll give you an example. For instance, today you come to know that a girl was raped, an urban middle class girl was raped. That's it. But tomorrow, if you come to know the girl who was raped, rape itself is a criminal offense, and there is no huge derogatory words. Cannot be any such word which can actually describe the barbaric nature through which this criminality is exposed or done. If I come to know that the girl who's being raped was actually a girl with a special need, was a girl from a very Dalit class, okay, and a girl who was actually a school dropout with multiple problems in her life, her conditions and her, her pathos become more difficult for us to, guess than it had been any other girl. So, these components actually crisscross into one another, making the genre even more plural than we could have thought of. Contributions of feminist theory to sociology, challenging the epistemology. In challenging sociological epistemology, feminists have pointed out that what sociologists have traditionally considered objectivity is in actuality an elitist standpoint, one that has historically been white and male. Smith and Collins have argued that the assumptions, conceptual tools, and the language of sociology are males created. They challenge this hegemon by arguing for an emphasis on women's experiences in everyday life. Smith and Collins, along with other standpoint theorists, contributed the insight that all knowledge emerges from the social position of the knower and can at best reflect only a partial understanding of the world. Today, it is widely accepted in sociology that different standpoints lead to differences, and these different standpoints is what make the sociological genre and trajectory even more plural than we could have thought of. Because we have understood at every point of time, knowledge is being manufactured, knowledge is being procured and proctored. Therefore, it depends upon who is the knower, who is actually delivering us the canons. That canonical master is one who has a mind of his own and his own privileges and presumptions which goes in his mind before he spells out something. Therefore, it's important to know what a male gaze is and how the knowledge that we are talking about is structured and manufactured. Third world feminism. Although there is no agreed upon definition of third world, in Western parlance it generally refers to countries that formerly were colonies of Western powers. Example: Netherlands, Belgium, Great Britain, Portugal, France, Germany and Italy. Or to countries whose economies are underdeveloped, frequently because of Western intervention. Third world feminist research explores the experiences of non-Western and indigenous women throughout the world, and then treats their experiences as central to feminist research. This definition does not resolve the conflict among non-Western feminists. One example is a mixed response to Somali-born Dutch-American feminist writer Ayaan Hirsi Ali's condemnation of Islamic practices such as genital mutilation. All the while we had been talking about the white feminism, but what about black feminism? What about feminism in different parts of the different parts of non-Western countries that are forthcoming, that are being contributed and that are being created? We are not talking about Islamic feminism. We are not talking about an ethnic feminism. We are not talking about the Dalit feminism. So all those standpoints are there, and which is what makes the feminist standpoint even more diverse, more bifurcated, and more seated with conflicts, because there are differences in their opinion. Serving in a plethora of lives and guises. Third world feminism, by virtue of its vexed historical origins and complicated negotiations with contemporary state apparatuses, is necessarily a chimerical, hydra-headed creature serving in a plethora of lives and guises. In some countries, it may manifest itself as an organized national movement, complete with the networks and regional chapters. In other countries, it may exist only as a kind of a hit-and-run guerrilla feminism. A feminism perhaps that arises spontaneously around issue-centered activity, that organizes itself in small, temporary and neighborhood groupings which may eschew or refuse the name of feminism altogether. The difficulty of discussing third world feminism arises in the first instance as a difficulty of identifying the conceptions and forms of effectivity in the third world that can be grasped as a feminist. So here lies the question of plurality. Now, what is feminism and how far can actually the representatives or the spokesperson of the particular community can form a structure like that? There may be countries where there are national movements and women-centric revolutions and rebellions happening, where the things that they face, the issues that plague them, come to the forefront and they become more vocal about it. But also at one point of time, we find those places, those villages, those small neighborhoods, that small marshy lands where women are not that conscious, and they try to solve their problems, coming out in groups, flocking together, identifying their issues, and forming groups and kinships and bonds between themselves. The sociology of non-human animals and society. The contemporary sociology of non-human animals in society emerged in the 1970s, when sociologists began to pay more attention to the scholarship and interrelationship between the social world and the natural world. Since then, sociologists have studied animal issue in nearly every major field of sociological research, and they have developed a subfield especially on the study of non-human animals. This had also been a special area of sociology where sociologists were actually concerned with the non-human animals and the kind of society that needs to be protected and created for them. The International Visual Sociology Association was founded in 1981. It describes visual sociology as a broad-ranging sociological field that includes, but is not limited to, documentary studies of everyday life, interpretive analysis of art and popular visual presentations, the commercial use of images and visual media, analysis of archival images, and the everyday image making. The visual turn in sociology has emerged in part because of a growing sense of the importance of visual communications, also because of technological developments in photography and videography, especially in the last few decades. The process of making and sharing visual materials also provides insights into social lives represented in visual narratives. So these visual image and visual sociology has been gaining ground, and we're also talking about a kind of visual ethnography, where we are trying to record what we see around us through the excellent communicational developments that we see around them. The sociology of risk, yet another. The study of risk is a relatively new enterprise within sociology, and after World War II, science was increasingly perceived as more dangerous, and suspicion crept into the public discourse that the use of some scientific discoveries have already started to change and destroy the natural environment. Because, risk society becomes important because with the post-modernity and with the unprecedented development in science and technology, we have come to believe that sociology is becoming more hazardous and more disruptive for us. There had been natural disasters, there had been earthquakes, there had been floods, and all sorts of different kind of things are happening around us. Some were man-made disasters, while some were natural, and we were trying very fast to go out of it. So with modernity, these were some of the pros and cons that we were carrying with ourselves, and therefore the sociology of risk developed that. I will expect that all of you will try to have a glance at each of the themes of that sociology tries to cover, and if you do so, you'll be able to understand why we are saying that the trajectory of sociology is so plural. Because the specialized areas of sociology are increasing with time, and they're becoming more and more diverse. For instance, the sociology of mental health, sociobiology, the sociology of science and technology, the sociology of violence, the emotional or the environmental justice, the sociology of food, sociology of the body and embodiment, the sociology of emotion, the sociology of friendship and children. All these things actually make sociology more significant, more plural, and more multiple with times. We conclude that the trajectory of sociology, as we see, are becoming more dynamic, and more we move into the genre of sociology, more we will see how the different perspectives and how the different crisscrossings go together to make the genre of sociology more interesting, more penetrative, more multiple, and more diverse in its way. I will always urge you to learn more about these different dimensions, probably those, for instance, sociology of friendship, sociology of emotions, something which you haven't read before. So other than the classical trajectories, these are the ones which actually make sociology more of an interesting read. And there are classical as well as contemporary readings on those areas where we can actually move to make the study even more fascinating and more interesting with the days to come. Thank you.